Halo 2 is a diamond of a video game, but you can't make diamonds without immense pressure. Halo 2's development is the most infamous example of crunch in the entire gaming industry. In the end, what the team at Bungie were able to pull off was nothing short of a cosmic miracle, a true testament to their skill and dedication. But the means in which that end was met were pretty horrendous. Aggressive deadlines, extreme overtime, developers living in their offices and having their families come visit them in the morning for breakfast, relationship breakups, divorces. Halo 2's development was excruciating for those involved. After E3 2003, Bungie returned to the office with the stark realization that what they'd just shown off and also spent 2 years building just didn't work and could never be released, which resulted in the Halo 2 that we got being made mostly in about a year and a half, with its developers having to go through the painful process of cutting extremely large amounts of content that they'd originally planned to be in the game. And that's where I come in. So today, we're going over pretty much everything that was cut from Halo 2's campaign, from levels and cutscenes, to weapons, vehicles, enemies, and even the entire Halo franchise's original ending that was meant to happen at the end of Halo 2. This one's going to be a doozy, my friends. Strap in. Okay, so let's begin by taking a look at the levels that were cut from Halo 2's campaign at various stages. And as you can probably tell by the length of this section of the video, there were quite a lot. Starting out, we have Covenant ship. So originally, what is arguably the most famous Halo cutscene ever made—
Permission to leave the station.
For what purpose, Master Chief?
To give the Covenant back their bomb.
—was in fact a fully playable level where you took the ship out yourself. Now, it went through multiple iterations, but all of them seemed to begin the same way as the cutscene that we eventually got. In the first draft of the level, Chief lands on the ship, climbs to its trench, and inserts through a maintenance airlock, where he's then jumped by a ton of drones, and then the gameplay begins. In the second draft, however, the insertion cutscene is much more similar to the final cutscene that we got, except this time, like before, there's sadly no space pickle. Instead, Chief just lands above the ship's exhaust, climbs into one of its trenches, then slides down to its fusion reactor where the gameplay begins. And speaking of gameplay, the plans for this level revolved around inserting into the ship alongside a team of ODSTs and also Miranda keys for some strange reason. Apparently the level was meant to be the main introduction to Miranda's character, and the gameplay would have involved jumping between trains with ODSTs and also taking out the Covenant in the process. It ended with you taking out the ship's fusion reactor with a Wraith, a Ghost, a Banshee, or according to this whiteboard sketch, possibly also a Scarab, which sounds quite cool. And then the final cutscene played, in which Chief would blast through the hull of the ship in a Ghost and break into free fall through Earth's atmosphere, only to land in the troop bay of Jonathan's Pelican as the cruiser crashes down behind him. And I'm not gonna lie, this storyboard actually looks really similar to the cutscene where Chief jumps out of the Spire into the Pelican in Halo Infinite. So I do wonder if inspiration was taken from these storyboards for that cutscene. If so, very cool. Next up, we have Alpha Moon, not to be mistaken for Moonbase that we covered in my last Halo 2 content video. Okay, here's a question. Have you ever thought that the aesthetic of burial mounds in Halo 2 feels kind of out of place? Well, there's a reason for that. It's because it was built from the leftovers of this cut level. Alpha Moon was set on Basis, which is the moon that orbited Alpha Halo's anchor planet, Threshold, thus making it the Alpha Moon. Ha 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 ha. It was part of the original Heretic story arc at the start of the campaign, and had you play as the Arbiter alongside Artas and the Spec Ops Covenant as you raided a Heretic camp on the moon. Now, sadly, very little is known about the level's gameplay. It was cut so early on in development that the Arbiter is still referred to as the Dervish. However, the dig site team are currently in the process of restoring it as best as possible, so at some point soon, hopefully we'll know a lot more about Alpha Moon. Remnants of the level did end up being used for both burial mounds and also in Quarantine Zone as well though, and according to Chris Butcher from Bungie, the level was drastically overambitious. We were building stuff that just couldn't be played in any engine. We built and detailed and went a huge way down the path with a whole bunch of environments and levels for the game that just totally didn't make it. If you look at the level with the flood inside the quarantine area, that is the remaining 20% of a gargantuan, sprawling level that was meticulously built and hand-constructed, but that could never, ever have shipped in any engine. But the level's ending has actually been revealed courtesy of Halo 2's storyboards, and it's a very interesting twist on the ending of the Oracle. So somehow, the Arbiter and the Heretic leader's final standoff takes place in Alpha Halo's control room. Very strange. After what looks like something of a bloody battle, the two form an alliance, and a proper one this time. Then, the Guilty Spark reveal happens, and as he's explaining the reality of the Covenant to the Arbiter, Tartarus comes in and shoots Caesar in the chest with a carbine, killing him, capturing Spark, and leaving. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I much prefer this version of the cutscene. In standard Halo 2, it always kind of irks me that the Arbiter is like genuinely listening to Spark's truth bombs, but Caesar opens fire anyway. Had he given Arbiter maybe just another minute or two to listen, he would have convinced him that the heretics weren't lying, but he thought that Arbiter was just simply too far gone, so he opened fire. But here, that doesn't happen. Caesar's death is also a lot sadder here as well, because obviously him and the Arbiter had clearly formed some kind of alliance, but it is what it is. Ooh, now next up we have one of my favourite Halo stories of all time that it will pain you to realise was once supposed to be a level. The Infinite Succor. Now this level was only ever briefly concepted and very, very early on at that, but originally Eddie Smith and Rob McLeese toyed with the idea of a flood outbreak on a Covenant hydroponic ship where their livestock had been consumed and used to form a gravemind. Of course, eventually this idea became the basis of The Last Voyage of the Infinite Succor from the graphic novel, which is the story of how Artas became Halfjaw, in which he leads a team of Spec Ops Covenant, including his friend and also the greatest swordsman to ever live, Bero Kusavai, on a raid into the Covenant agricultural ship that went dark in the wake of the outbreak on Alpha Halo. When they arrive, they realise quite quickly that the entire ship has been infected by the flood, and after attempts to save a rather spiteful and selfish minor prophet that was on board, it becomes very clear that the ship must be destroyed. With all his squad now infected, Artas engages in a final duel with Kusavai, who unfortunately is in the process of infection, where he puts his friend out of his misery at the cost of his mandibles, and sets the ship on a collision course into the sun. That's of course a very brief summary of the story, but to cut it short, The Last Voyage of the Infinite Succor is amazing, not just from a narrative standpoint, but also aesthetically as well. And it's one that I seriously hope either the Halo 1 remake or the Halo 2 remake, if we ever get it, resurrects as kind of something of an origin story for everybody's favourite half-jawed Spec Ops commander. Artas deserves his origin story, and the Infinite Succor deserves to be a level. Ooh, Forerunner Tank. Now this one is iconic. So Forerunner Tank was a duo of levels that were meant to be set between Quarantine Zone and Gravemind that depicted both Chief and Arbiter's journey to the Gravemind's lair through the bowels of Delta Halo. But the storyboards for it open with an alternate version of the final Quarantine Zone cutscene. So here, Chief is present alongside Miranda and Johnson. Arbiter gets the drop on them, like usual, and 1v3s them, eventually forcing Chief into a fistfight with him before Tartarus' Phantom arrives and the brutes begin to circle all four of them, because this, of course, is where the Great Schism would have begun. Luckily for the allies, though, a Flood Hulk arrives to crash the party. Now, the Flood Hulk looks like a Sharkoi, but I think it was meant to be a very early version of the Flood Juggernaut. The brutes take the Hulk out, but the crushing weight of it coming down brings the platform down and causes it to collapse, sending Chief and Arbiter plummeting into the abyss. Arbiter vanishes into the darkness, but Chief lands about halfway down, grabs a brute shot, and it fades to gameplay, where he fights through the flood-ridden underbelly of Delta Halo. Now, by the looks of it, this was done both on foot and also in the eponymous Forerunner tank, which was described by Jason Jones as something that was awesome, blows things up, glows a lot from little windows, and moves real fast. The idea was for Chief to be driving this tank through dark tunnels while the Gravemind's tentacles smash down beside you and race throughout the facility, moving behind doors like racing freight trains, before of course eventually reaching the Gravemind himself. Now, of course, this Forerunner tank never made the cut into Halo 2, and sadly, it's still not been resurrected to this day, although its geometry was kind of reused for the Quarantine Zone gondola, so I guess it kinda lives on. As for the Arbiter's level, which it seems would have been the second of the two levels, sadly, we don't really know anything about it besides how it ends. So the Arbiter reaches the Gravemind's lair undetected and watches the Gravemind speaking to Chief. But he's eventually detected by a horde of Flood who enter the room and is captured. And then the Gravemind cutscene that we all know and love and dream about on a daily basis begins. Now, by the sounds of it, Bungie really loved this level and were really genuinely sad that it had to be cut. So sad, in fact, that somebody hid a poem written by Joe Staten that mourned its cancellation in the Halo 2 editing kit. And it went as follows. Oh tank, ill-defined, silent monkey on our backs. No whiteboard will e'er display your design. Were you raft, or Forerunner submarine, or monument to our sins? Okay, quick time out from Halo to talk about Cold Turkey. Now, I'm currently on a very hardcore cut, so Cold Turkey to me is like methane to a grunt. But when it comes to breaking habits, there's a better way. With no Forerunner space magic involved whatsoever, today's sponsor, Fume, look at this problem in a different way. Fume is an award-winning, innovative flavoured air device that removes the bad from your habit. It's completely natural and uses flavoured air with a range of all natural, delicious flavours. With Fume, you can still enjoy your habit, but in a natural, guilt-free way. It has a super high quality, robust build that comes with a built-in adjustable airflow dial, along with tons of tactile moving parts and magnets for fidgeting, which helps to de-stress while you break your habit. And recently, they also launched Base, which is a super sturdy weighted stand to rest your Fume on when it's not in use. This thing looks really stylish and also has a really strong magnet that not only holds your Fume, but allows it to be spun whilst it's on the base. As for the flavours, well, there's a ton of them and they all taste amazing. Right now, I'm using crisp mint, which I gotta say is not only crisp, not only minty, but very refreshing as well. Fume has served over 300,000 customers, and you can be the next success story. For a limited time, use my code HiddenXperia to get your free Fume base when you order the Journey Pack. It's the all-new magnetic stand for your Fume device. Just head on over to tryfume.com, that's tryfum.com, and use code HiddenXperia or scan the QR code on screen to get your free Fume base when you order your Journey Pack today. And the final fully cut level is Earth Arc, which in true Halo 2 fashion was in fact 3 levels designed as one. And in fact, it was the level embodiment of the original ending of not just Halo 2, but of Halo in its entirety. So Earth Arc was where Halo 2's cliffhanger ending was going to continue, and it was written at a time when not only was the Ark a location on Earth, but also at a time when humans and Forerunners were synonymous. So, Halo's final act picks up as the key ship appears above Earth alongside the Covenant, and after speaking to Lord Hood and realising where he is, Chief blows a hole in the hatch of the ship and begins his descent to Earth. On the surface, in Eastern Africa, Covenant carriers have gathered in low orbit above the Ark. Marines are engaged in ground warfare with the Covenant, and it's looking like a losing battle, until suddenly the ground behind them explodes in a plume of dust. They turn to react, terrified at what it might be, only for the Master Chief to emerge from the dust cloud, inspiring them to charge the Covenant artillery over the creek bed, where the gameplay begins and you presumably take out the artillery. The next cutscene opens with Chief and the Marines peering over a ledge right at the Ark, only to see an incomprehensible number of brute warriors, who spot them and immediately begin charging. With death all but certain, Chief readies his weapon and the Marines prepare for their last stand. And then suddenly, even more Covenant capital ships appear above them, only to begin glassing the brutes, turning the entire army to ash before the valiant humans. It turns out that these ships belong to the elites, who arrived at Earth at the last moment to support the humans and stop the Covenant once and for all. Pretty badass entry if you ask me. Suddenly, the arc pillars begin to rise out of the ground, and 7 phantoms, one containing the Arbiter and one piloted by Miranda and Johnson, come to ground and pick Chief up, and they descend into the trench surrounding the arc where gameplay begins. Presumably, this gameplay section would have been pretty similar to the final section of the Covenant in Halo 3, because it ends with a cutscene where Chief, Arbiter, and Spark as well approach Truth at the helm of the arc. He and the Arbiter have their final conversation, and as Arbiter raises his plasma rifle at Truth, the cutscene fades to gameplay, where presumably you'd actually pull the trigger and kill the Prophet yourself, much like Bungie's original plan for Halo 3 as well, and it fades back to a cutscene where Truth is wounded on the floor, and the Arbiter finishes him off, not by stabbing him with a sword, but by snapping his neck with his hand. Chief deactivates the Halo rings, which simultaneously causes the Ark's pillars to turn into energy cannons that then fire flares up through the atmosphere, eventually creating portals that send them to the Halos. We then cut to Gamma Halo of all Halo rings, where the flare arrives and basically does exactly what it does to Delta Halo at the end of the actual Halo 2. Now, interestingly here as well, given that there were only 5 flares, that also makes it look like there were only 5 Halos, not 7 at this point in development. Well, maybe there were 6, given that Alpha Halo at this point was destroyed, 6 Halos and the Arc, which would add up to the Bungie 7, but the idea of there only being 5 Halo rings is, or 6 I guess, is quite weird. Anyway, back on the Ark, the facility starts to collapse, but Spark leads the two through a tunnel that leads even deeper into the facility, and once again it fades to gameplay, where you'd fight off brute honor guards as the construct collapses around you before escaping, with Chief running into a bright bloom of light as he escapes, which then transitions into a final medal ceremony complete with 0G fireworks. Bungie's words, not mine. Chief, Johnson, and Miranda, all out of armor, yes, Chief not in his armor, have a final scene together where they watch the victory parade. But the shot then cuts back to the Arbiter inside the Ark, where Spark leads him to a data vault, kilometers high and pulsating with holographic data. Suddenly, an explosion causes a large chunk of the facility to crash down on what they realize is a sarcophagus, located at the base of the vault. And when they go down to it, they realize what was buried within this Forerunner sarcophagus. A human skeleton, delivering the hinted at but never before revealed shock twist that humans are in fact Forerunner. Spark then flies Arbiter out of the Ark, kind of like how he does with Johnson at the end of Halo 2, and the elites have their own victory ceremony where he and Artas plot their course back to San Helios, and the credits roll. But that wasn't the end. Now, very interestingly, despite Bungie at the time of creating this storyboard being adamant that this was the absolute end to Halo's story, this version of the story still has the exact same post-credit scene as the Halo 2 that we got. That very scene where Cortana is trapped on the flood-infected High Charity with the Gravemind. Now, that would have been a painful note to end the series on and never resolve. The Flood are still out there, undefeated, and the series just ends there and that's it. I can kind of see why they didn't go with this in the end. Now though, regarding the huge final twist that the Arbiter discovers in the sarcophagus, it was very clear throughout the original trilogy that Bungie viewed the humans as Foreigners. The two were meant to be one and the same. The main stories of Halo 1, 2, 3, and also certain books, in particular Joe Staten's Contact Harvest, quite literally objectively say that the two were the same. Although Halo 3's terminals do begin to muddy the water a little tiny bit, overall, with Bungie at least, it was very clear that they saw the two species as the same, and it wasn't until 343 took over that they were turned into entirely separate species. Now, I will caveat this by saying that I forget where, but somewhere in the Forerunner trilogy, it's either hinted at or outright stated that humans and Foreigners do share a common ancestor, but somewhere down their evolutionary paths they split into two separate species. But even with that in mind, I gotta say, I vastly prefer Bungie's take on this whole thing, and that's coming from someone who is a self-confessed Forerunner trilogy fanboy who films every video with Silentium's cover art framed right behind him. I just think that all these kind of crazy, super futuristic and incomprehensible structures across space, in fact being built by our ancient ancestors who sacrificed themselves to stop the Flood from consuming everything, is just such a goddamn cool story twist. And when you split humans and Forerunners apart, you lose the incredible moment of realization that that twist has. At some point, I do still plan on making that video breaking down the whole humans equal Forerunners debate, where I'm going to go into much more detail about both sides of that argument, but god damn it, spoilers for that video, but I really gotta say, I vastly prefer the way that Bungie handled this. So that covers all of the cut levels. Now let's take a look at some very early versions of levels that we eventually did get, starting out with the incredibly iconic Earth City. Earth City was the first thing the world ever saw of Halo 2. It was a morphing of Outskirts and Metropolis set in a rather different version of New Mombasa that was known as the Arcology. Now, it had much more vehicle and urban combat than what we eventually got, and it really let you explore the kind of neo-futurist New Mombasa more than any level that we got in Halo 2. And thanks to the Dig Site team, you can actually play it after all these years. Link is in the description, as with any of the playable levels in this video. And secondly, we have the original High Charity, specifically the original ending of High Charity. Now, believe it or not, Chief didn't always Superman his way onto the key ship. Instead, there used to be a Warthog run, which Vengeful Fadam restored in its entirety for his amazing Halo 2 Uncut mod. Link in the description as well. So, you drive through some sort of conduit construct thing, don't know what it is, but it looks really cool, and it's packed full of Covenant and Flood, before launching the Warthog into the key ship at the end. Okay, now let's talk about some cut enemies, starting out with an enemy that is quite possibly the most iconic enemy in all of Bungie lore, the Sharkoi. Originating from Marathon, where they were called the Hulks, they were originally meant to carry over from Marathon into Halo as the Driniol, or the Drinol in Halo CE, but they were cut. Then, when Halo 2 rolled around, Bungie tried to get them in again, changing their name now to the Sharkoi for some reason, but sadly, once again, they didn't make the cut. They were canonized in the Conversations from the Universe booklet that came with Halo 2's Limited Edition, where they had a very brief offhand mention, before then falling into canon obscurity again for some 13 years at least, until 2017, where Halo Envoy finally brought them back into the fold and for good. They aren't exactly in the forefront of the universe, but I really hope at some point, whether it's in the Halo 1 remake or in Halo 7 or whatever, they finally get officially added to a Halo campaign, because man, the Sharkoi have been waiting in the wings of the Halo universe for so long now, it's about damn time they show up in a game. Speaking of things from Marathon, next up we have the space jellyfish that were meant to exist as wildlife that were native to the gas giant of Threshold. Now, they were based on life forms apparently that might hypothetically exist in the atmosphere of gas giants like Jupiter, but sadly they were cut from the game because their designer, David Dunn, had the idea for them to make sounds that went a little bit like this. Bloop bloop, which was deemed preposterous. Now, I said earlier, speaking of things from Marathon, and there's a reason for that. So, in Marathon Infinity, a kind of similar looking creature floats about in the hub levels electric sheep that occur in the Marines' kind of weird state of dream nightmare limbo. It's a very loose Marathon connection, but you know what I'm like with Marathon and Halo. If there's a connection to be talked about, you damn straight I'm going to talk about it. Now, this one kind of blew my mind. I had no idea about it until I was researching for this video. So, in Halo 2 originally, the Jackals were going to be quite revolutionary. So, it's common knowledge at this point that in Halo 2 you were originally meant to be able to pick up the Jackal's shield and hold it like a riot shield kind of thing, but it seems like Bungie's ideas for the shield far transcended just being able to pick it up and dual-wield it. So, according to these really early sketches from John Butkus, the Jackal Shield was originally able to fire a projectile, was able to collect energy from plasma weapons that were fired at it, and then send it all back in one blast, and even able to create a protective dome of energy that surrounds the Jackal. This is stuff that I'd like to see in a future game, not gonna lie. And very briefly, on the topic of Jackal shields, there was a carrier form variant in Halo 2's files that seemingly had a Jackal shield embedded within its biomass. Now, whether this was meant to be a Jackal turned carrier form, or is just a visual bug, or was a prototype for some sort of armored carrier form, we have no idea. All we know is that this right here is a thing that exists. But hands down, the most iconic cut enemy of all time is the Flood Juggernaut. So this thing was originally meant to appear in the Oracle, Sacred Icon, and Quarantine Zone, and they were simultaneously giant Flood Hulks, but also local leaders for the Flood. If they were taken out, all local combat forms would go dormant, but that was the thing, taking them out was going to be tough. So they had two massive tentacles that did immense damage to both players and vehicles, and could launch objects really far. They could jump extremely high in the air, they could climb walls, and they could even cover their faces, which is where their 6 infection forms resided, with their tentacles. When low on health, they'd also go berserk and slam their tentacles into the ground before roaring at you. Now, thankfully, the Juggernauts are fully established in the canon now. They exist, so fingers crossed. They're crossed so hard they're snapping right now that not if, when the Flood eventually do return, the Juggernaut comes with them, because man, it's about damn time. And finally, we have a cut enemy that actually indirectly made its way into Halo 2, but by accident. It's a weird story, we'll get to it in a second. This enemy is the Needler Sentinel. So on Quarantine Zone, for some peculiar reason, there's one Sentinel that fires Needler rounds, but as strange as it sounds, this Needler Sentinel isn't actually the cut Needler Sentinel. It's just a very, very coincidental glitch. So instead, the original Needler Sentinel was from a point of the game where there were several variants of the Sentinel Beam, all of which, again, Vengeful Vadam restored in Halo 2 Uncut. So of course, there was the Needle Sentinel Beam and its attached Sentinel that fired the red needles that the Enforcer fires. Then there was the Sentinel Grenade Launcher, which fired the grenades that the Enforcer fires. And finally, the Sentinel Charge Bolt, which essentially acted like a railgun. All of which presumably had their own Sentinel variants attached as well. So, some point in development, there was a Grenade Launcher Sentinel and even a Railgun Sentinel. And speaking of weapons, let's have a look now at a ton of weapons and vehicles that were sadly left on Halo 2's cutting room floor. A load of them, in fact, have only recently been discovered by the dig site team, and so there are tons of these that I had no idea existed until now. But first off, let's start out with a familiar weapon that has deserved a comeback for 23 years now. The Flamethrower. Now, interestingly, Halo 2's version is almost identical to the Halo 3 model, except of course it's held in first person over third, which I gotta say I much prefer. I do not like Halo 3's Flamethrower at all. Halo 1's remains the king, but god damn we need a new one in Halo. It's been way too long. But interestingly, the UNSC Flamethrower wasn't the only flamethrower cut from Halo 2. Yes, in my idea of a perfect dream, there was also a Covenant flamethrower called the Disintegrator, which was meant to be in Halo 2, which fired a red flame. Sadly though, it was cut really early on in development, alongside also a unique enemy that was going to wield it, the Disintegrator Hunter, which sounds really badass. Back to human gear, at one point a flashbang was meant to be in Halo 2, which obviously would blind and stun its enemies, but seemingly only in campaign, thank god. It was cut later in development, but at some point there was the idea to move the blind and stun effect over to the frag grenade to make it more effective beyond raw damage output, but clearly that was cut as well. Much like Halo 3's chain gun, originally you were meant to be able to detach the GPMG from its stand and carry it around with you in Halo 2 as well, except again this time in first person. And by the looks of it, this thing made it quite far through development because it seems mostly complete. It also sounds badass as hell and is really fun to use. And speaking of the turrets, there was also meant to be a grenade launcher turret as well, although whether or not it was meant to be detachable like the GPMG, I'm not quite sure. The suppressed SMG, which of course eventually made its debut in ODST, was originally meant to be in Halo 2 as well. Now, the Halo 2 version has been available to use ever since Halo 2 Vista launched in 2007, so this one should be nothing new. It sounds pretty cool, but I mean, it's literally just a standard M7 SMG with a suppressor threaded on the barrel. There are no changes to AI behavior when using it either, which is unfortunate, but given Halo 2's scrap stealth mechanics, I'd hazard a guess that at some point in development, it was meant to let you take enemies out quietly. Gotta say it again, I really want that in a new Halo game. And finally for the UNSC gear, satchel charges were cut as well. Now, who knows what they would have functioned like, but maybe they would have let us open that door ourselves without hunter assistance. Just an idea. Moving on over to the Covenant gear, we have the incredibly gnarly sounding Blamite Harpoon, which does exactly what it says on the tin, and it was supposed to be Bungie's second attempt at getting a harpoon-styled weapon in Halo after its predecessor was cut from Halo 1. Recently, the Plasma Mortar was discovered by the dig site team. Now, all we have for this thing right now is its model, which honestly looks really reminiscent of Halo 1's cut gravity wrench weapon. But I think it's safe to assume that it launched plasma mortars, maybe like the plasma launcher. It's kind of a good assumption given that, it's literally called the Plasma Mortar. On the topic of cut Halo 1 weapons, the gravity rifle was originally meant to be in Halo 2 as well, and this is a weapon that I have a very weird affinity for. It was restored in CE Plus a few years ago by a great team of modders, many of whom are now on the dig site team, and I love how this thing looks and sounds and behaves. I'd love to see it come back at some point looking exactly like this. And lastly for the Covenant, they were meant to have some kind of EMP mine, which, well, I'll let you guess what the EMP mine did. As for the Forerunners, as we touched on earlier, there were meant to be 3 additional variants of the Sentinel Beam that Verdam restored in Halo 2 Uncut. There was the Sentinel Needler that fired the Enforcer's red needles, the Sentinel Grenade Launcher that fired the Enforcer's grenades, and the Sentinel Charge Shot, which was something of a Sentinel railgun. Seriously, if you haven't done so already, go and download Halo 2 Uncut, you will not regret it. And finally, let's go over Halo 2's laundry list of cut vehicles, starting out with what is nowadays considered probably the most beloved Halo vehicle of all time that has its roots in Halo 2, the Falcon. Yep, you heard right, the Falcon was meant to be in Halo 2. So it was designed by Marcus Leto as sort of kind of mini Pelican, designed to ferry troops in and out of hot zones, armed with a nose-mounted chain gun and 2 passenger seats. It was originally meant to kind of play like a Black Hawk type vehicle, but sadly it was eventually cut. Marcus loved the idea though, so he continued to iterate on it between Halo 2 and Halo 3's development, which eventually led to the Hornet, although he said that he wasn't too satisfied with the Hornet, so he continued to iterate on it even more during Reach's development until we got the Falcon that is now quite possibly the most beloved Halo vehicle of all time. The Mongoose had its roots in Halo 2 as well. It looked and functioned almost the same as Halo 3's, except with no passenger seat and with an extra variant that added front-mounted guns much like the Gun Goose, although it was later scrapped because Bungie thought that it interfered too much with the Warthog and the Ghost in the sandbox. But then of course it was brought back in Halo 3 solely as a support vehicle, with its gun-toting brother being revived in Halo 2 Anniversary. Back into the air, we have the Strike Fighter, which may have been the earliest iteration of the Saber, or rather the idea that created the Saber. So it was designed to be a defensive space fighter that you'd see in the opening battle above Earth, and actually was never intended to be in the gameplay because, according to Marcus, they just couldn't find a way to fit it in. So it was demoted to a cutscene only vehicle before being cut entirely because there wasn't enough time to add it in. Now, for some reason, this thing has always reminded me of the Naboo Starfighter from Phantom Menace. Maybe it was because I saw this in the Halo 2 documentary around the same time that Phantom Menace came out, give or take a few years, not sure, but it looks kind of similar to me. Okay, these next two come as a pair. Halo 2 was actually meant to have 2 tank variants, the Sun Devil and the Tarantula, which I gotta say are 2 really cool names. They were both Scorpions modified with anti-air capabilities, with the Sun Devil replacing the main cannon with 2 pairs of twin-linked 40mm autocannons and a target acquisition radar assembly, whilst the Tarantula came with dual scimitar rocket pods. You'll be happy to hear though that both are entirely canon now, with the Sun Devil excelling against slower moving air targets like Banshees, whilst apparently the Tarantula proves mostly ineffective. Poor guy. Staying in the tune of variants, there were originally meant to be quite a few different kinds of Warthog in Halo 2 as well. There was the Tropic Hog, which came with a kind of jungle-styled camo finish, the Arctic Hog that came with an enclosed cabin and quad tracks, the Recovery Hog, which is just the Troop Hog that we got in Halo 3, and the Rocket Hog, which, I've gotta say, is the coolest looking Rocket Hog in all of Halo. There was also supposed to be a desert hog and a night mission camo warthog as well, but no pictures or models of these exist. Moving over to the high seas, just like almost every Bungie Halo game, water vehicles were concepted and scrapped, with the Orca being their attempt at making it work in Halo 2. Sadly though, there are no pictures or models of the Orca, nor are there any for its variant, the Mortar Orca. So hopefully this footage of the dig site team's splash site water racing level will be equal parts fitting and nostalgic. As for the Covenant vehicles, starting out we have a vehicle that took Bungie literally 3 attempts to finally get in a game, the Anti-Air Wraith. I mean, this thing is literally just an anti-aircraft Wraith, there's not really much else to say here. Going back to the variants, the Ghost was also meant to have a few as well. There was going to be an Excavation Ghost, which, no, I can hear you getting excited, is not a Ghost with dual front-mounted Scarab guns, I am afraid to say, but rather it was meant to be a uniquely styled Heretic Ghost, kind of like the Heretic Banshee. There was also going to be a VTOL Ghost, which I guess was intended to fly in some capacity, and also a Special Forces Ghost, which likely would have just been used by the Spec Ops team that wiped the Heretics out. Now, something I had no idea was meant to be in Halo 2 until researching for this video was the Chopper. Yep, the Chopper was meant to be in Halo 2, although in this game, at least in its development, it was referred to as the Brute Cycle, and sadly, it was only ever present in some of Eddie Smith's concept art, but I gotta say, it looks near identical to the Chopper that we ended up getting in Halo 3. And speaking of things that I had no idea existed, you guys remember the blood mounts that the Locust rode into battle in Gears of War 2 and Gears of War 3? Well, apparently the Brutes of Halo 2 were supposed to have their own versions of the blood mount, referred to as Brute mounts. Now, God knows what creatures these were meant to be. I want to say a Sharkoi, but somehow I doubt it. Even still, you're going to need a big creature to support the weight of a Brute. That said though, I will say when the Sharkoi are eventually added to a game, I'd kind of love to see this Reach concept art of the Covenant riding a Guta finally turn into gameplay with the Sharkoi. They'd be kind of perfect for it. Okay, so if you saw my video recently about Halo 2's Milestone 1 levels, then these next 2 ships will be very familiar to you. This is the Command Shuttle, which is a much bigger, much more heavily armoured take on the Spirit, which in the level M1 exploration was parked up outside a Forerunner structure and acted as the Covenant's local base of operations. Oh, and also this thing was meant to fly with its cockpit facing forward, unlike the Spirit, which had it facing backwards for some reason. Who can understand Covenant engineering, seriously? Now, call it a hunch, but I think the Lich that was introduced in Halo 4 was actually based on this thing, considering that it not only fills a very similar role in its use, but also looks an awful lot like this very early blockout of the Command Shuttle. And then there's the Lightbridge ship, which does exactly what it says in the tin. It's a ship that was used to create light bridges to bridge gaps over canyons and the like, so Covenant troops could pass over them unscathed. Very situational, but it's a cool concept nonetheless. And finally, we have some variants of what has been unanimously decided upon as the greatest Halo vehicle of all time, the Covenant Bus, or as it's known by the Covenant, the Shadow. Now, if you don't love the Shadow and think that this thing is hands down the best Halo vehicle of all time, well, I hate to break the news to you, but you're a fake Halo fan. Your Halo card has officially been revoked. I'm sorry, that's just the way that it goes. So for all of you real Halo fans who love and adore the Shadow more than anything in life, it's gonna pain you to learn that this thing was actually meant to have 2 extra variants. There was gonna be the Troop Shadow, which Verdam restored, and is literally just a shadow with a ton of seats in its center for infantry, and then the Excavator Shadow, which, again, like the Ghost, although it sounds like it was meant to have a Scarab's excavation beam as its turret, that wasn't the case. It was just meant to be a Heretic Shadow, basically, that had that really cool Heretic Banshee texture that was only ever seen on the Banshee, but I kind of wish more vehicles got it. Yeah, that's what this thing was meant to be, but god damn it, Shadow Bros, we lost. We lost. So my friends, that just about does it. In one gargantuan effort, we've covered pretty much everything that was cut from Halo 2's campaign. You know, it really is a shame how god-awful Halo 2's development was. You know, out there, somewhere, there's a timeline where Bungie somehow released a version of Halo 2 that's even better than the one that we got. That said though, I gotta say, despite how atrocious Halo 2's development was, it's frankly insane that Bungie managed to still release a game that is considered one of, if not the best video game of all time. It's truly a testament to how, devoted, talented, driven, and well-managed and directed the developers over at Bungie were. So, with that said, let's round this gargantuan video out there. I want to give a huge thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there, as per usual. Thank you all so much, and thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all in the next one.